You did everything right, not perfectly. Nobody does anything perfectly, but genuinely. You showed up, you stayed patient when patience was the hardest thing. You loved them in the specific, careful, attentive way that their complexity seemed to require. You made space for their distance without disappearing. You held the relationship together through stretches where you were essentially holding it alone. And somewhere in all of that, somewhere in the accumulated weight of all that genuine, sustained effort, you got tired. Not dramatically, not in a single breaking moment. Just quietly, thoroughly, finally tired. And you started to let go. And that is precisely when they woke up. The timing feels cruel. It is not accidental. There is a psychological phenomenon at the heart of avoidant attachment that explains more about the specific torture of this timing than almost anything else. It is not unique to avoidance. It exists across human psychology in various forms. But in the avoidant, it operates with a particular intensity that makes the experience of loving them and leaving them uniquely disorienting. It is the phenomenon of devaluation and revaluation. And understanding it, not just intellectually, but in the felt, specific sense of recognizing your own experience inside it, changes the story you have been telling yourself about what happened. During the relationship, or during the period of your sustained pursuit or availability, the avoidance deactivating strategies were engaged in a continuous project of keeping their investment in you at a manageable level. Part of how that project operates is through a subtle but persistent cognitive distortion, the amplification of your flaws and the minimization of your qualities. Not consciously, not maliciously, but systematically. Because the deactivation strategy needs material to work with, it needs reasons why this connection is not that significant, why you are not that irreplaceable, why the distance is reasonable rather than costly. And so the mind, in service of the strategy, generates those reasons. Finds the things about you that are imperfect or incompatible or simply not quite right. Holds them at the front of awareness, while the things about you that are extraordinary get filed somewhere less accessible. This is not a character failing. It is the attachment system doing what it was built to do, protecting against the vulnerability of genuine investment by keeping the investment below the threshold where loss would be devastating. And then you leave, or you detach, or you simply stop being consistently available in the way you always were, and something in the system shifts with a speed and completeness that can feel, from the outside, almost absurd. Because suddenly, in your absence, or in the presence of your genuine withdrawal, the devaluation reverses. The qualities that were being minimized come forward. The flaws that were being amplified recede. And what the avoidant is left with is something close to the accurate picture of who you actually are, what you actually brought, what your presence in their life actually meant. The cruel irony is that this accurate picture required your absence to become visible. The very presence that made the devaluation necessary, because presence meant investment, investment meant vulnerability, vulnerability meant threat. That presence was also obscuring the view. And now, in the specific quality of light that only absence provides, they can see clearly for what may be the first time. What they see stops them. The stopping is not dramatic usually. It does not always announce itself as a realization. It can arrive as a vague restlessness, a recurring thought they keep pushing away. A disproportionate response to something small, a song, a place, an ordinary Tuesday that has no business feeling as heavy as it does. It can arrive as a comparison, someone new, someone available, someone perfectly adequate, held against the memory of you, and found inexplicably lacking in something they cannot immediately name. What they cannot name is specific. It is not your appearance or your humor or any single attributable quality. It is the totality, the accumulated specific, irreplaceable texture of being known by you, of being in the presence of someone who understood them in the particular way you understood them, who stayed through the parts that should have ended things, who loved them with a consistency and a depth that they were, during the relationship engaged in the continuous project of not fully feeling. They are feeling it now. Without the buffer of your presence to manage it against, without the deactivating strategy having anything concrete to work with. Just the feeling, in its full and unmanaged size, arriving in the space where you used to be. This is the moment the title of this conversation describes, the realization arriving too late. And before going any further, the word late needs to be examined, because late implies a window that has closed, a threshold that has been crossed. And the question of whether that threshold is actually definitively crossed, or whether it is simply shifted, changed, requiring something different to reopen, that question is more complex than the clean narrative of too late would suggest. There are situations where late is genuinely finally late, where the person who left has rebuilt sufficiently, has grown past the dynamic completely, has arrived at a place where the avoidance realization, however genuine, however transformative, does not intersect with anywhere they currently are or want to be. Where the closure is real and the door is not just closed but no longer a door they are oriented toward. In those situations, late means what it says. The window existed, it required things the avoidant could not provide at the time, and it closed. But there are also situations where late is not the end of the story, where the realization, arriving in the wake of genuine loss, catalyzes something that earlier comfort could not. Where the avoidant, finally confronted with the full weight of what their pattern cost them, makes contact with a motivation that was never previously available. Not the motivation of wanting to keep something comfortable, but the motivation of someone who has genuinely lost something and is for the first time willing to pay the real price of getting it back. Not the price of grand gestures, the price of internal work, of sustained, uncomfortable, professional level engagement with the patterns that produced the loss. The difference between those two situations is not something you can determine from the outside. It is something that only reveals itself through what they actually do with the realization. Let's talk about what the realization feels like from inside their experience, because this is territory that is rarely described with any accuracy, and understanding it changes the way you interpret whatever contact or shift in behavior you may have observed or be observing. The realization does not arrive as a clean epiphany. It does not feel, from the inside, like suddenly understanding something that was previously obscure. It feels more like a lifting of fog that reveals a landscape that was always there, that they were somehow not seeing despite standing directly in front of it. There is a quality of disbelief to it, of how did I not see this clearly before, of something obvious that somehow required this specific angle of light to become visible. Alongside that is something that functions like shame, though an avoidant will rarely call it that. A recognition that the behavior, the withdrawal, the management, the continuous subtle devaluation was not neutral, that it had a cost, that someone real absorbed that cost quietly, patiently, for longer than they should have needed to, and that the absorbing of that cost was not nothing, was not the behavior of someone who was fine with the arrangement, was the behavior of someone who loved them enough to stay inside significant discomfort because the connection felt worth it. That recognition of having been loved at a level they were not fully meeting lands with a weight that the avoidance system is not equipped to process efficiently. Because processing it fully would require sitting with guilt and grief and self-examination in a way that the defensive architecture actively resists, and so it circulates, unresolved, showing up in the restlessness, in the recurring thoughts, in the disproportionate responses to ordinary triggers. What the avoidant does with that circulating, unresolved recognition is the variable that determines everything. Some turn it outward, they reach toward you, with a quality of presence and honesty that was not previously available. Some turn it inward. They begin, finally, the internal work that the pattern has been pointing toward for their entire relational life. Some do both simultaneously, and some do neither. They allow the discomfort to gradually dull, as discomfort tends to do when it is neither acted on nor processed, and they continue the pattern with the next person, carrying the unexamined weight of the realization as a slightly heavier version of the sadness they have always moved through the world with. Which of these occurs depends on factors that are genuinely outside your influence, the degree of self-awareness they bring to the realization, the support structures available to them, the depth of their willingness to be uncomfortable in service of genuine change. Whether anyone or anything in their life is holding them accountable to the growth the moment is pointing toward. These are internal and circumstantial variables that belong entirely to their own life and their own trajectory. And this is the place where you have to practice the most difficult form of acceptance available. Not the acceptance of something you never wanted, but the acceptance of genuine powerlessness over something you care about. You cannot want the realization to produce change more effectively than they want it to. You cannot supply the willingness from the outside. You cannot be the reason they do the work, because a reason that external is not robust enough to sustain the work through the difficulty it inevitably encounters. Their realization is theirs. Whatever it produces is theirs. And your life, the one happening right now, the one that continued and deepened and became more fully your own in the process of finally releasing the grip of the dynamic, that life is yours, completely, finally, irrevocably yours. and that life has something in it now that it did not have at the beginning of all this: a specificity. A clarity about what you require that can only come from the extended, detailed, sometimes painful experience of going without it. You know things now in the body, not just in the mind, that change how you will enter the next significant connection. You know the feeling of managing someone else's emotional temperature, and you know the cost of it in a way that is no longer abstract. You know the particular loneliness of being loved at a volume you cannot hear. You know what it feels like to decode rather than receive, to translate rather than be spoken to directly. That knowledge is protective in the best possible sense, not the protection of walls, the protection of discernment. The ability to recognize early, before significant investment, the signs of a dynamic that will ask more of you than it returns. The ability to feel the pull of intensity without mistaking it for depth. The ability to sit with the discomfort of someone's unavailability long enough to name it accurately, rather than explaining it away. That discernment does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself as wisdom, or present itself as a new confidence that is immediately visible and fully formed. It arrives quietly, in small moments, as a slightly different quality of attention you bring to new situations. A pause before you override your own perception. A willingness to let what is actually happening land, rather than immediately reframing it into something more comfortable. A new and unfamiliar habit of believing the first thing you notice, rather than the third or fourth interpretation, the one that required the most creative optimism to construct. You built that, not by trying to build it, by living through something that demanded it be built, by surviving a dynamic that required such sustained, precise attention to someone else's interior that your perceptual faculties were refined in the process, whether you intended them to be or not. The instrument was sharpened by use. And now the instrument belongs entirely to you, pointed at your own life, available for your own protection and your own navigation. There is something else that living inside this particular dynamic tends to produce, that is less often named but equally real. It produces a specific quality of compassion, not the naive compassion of someone who hasn't yet been hurt enough to know what it costs, but the seasoned kind. The kind that can hold the full complexity of a person, their damage and their beauty, their limitation and their genuine love, without collapsing that complexity into a simpler story, without needing them to be a villain in order to justify your own pain, without needing them to be a victim in order to justify continued sympathy. That quality of compassion is rare. It requires having genuinely loved someone who was difficult to love, having stayed present with someone's complexity long enough to understand it from the inside rather than observing it from a comfortable distance. Having been hurt by someone you simultaneously understood, which is a much harder experience than being hurt by someone you can simply be angry at. Anger is clarifying. Understanding is complicated. And you develop the capacity to hold the complication rather than reducing it to something easier. That capacity will serve you in every significant relationship you enter from this point forward. Not because you will choose difficult people, the discernment will steer you away from dynamics that cost too much. But because the depth of understanding you bring to the people you love, the quality of genuine seeing that you are now capable of, is one of the most valuable things one human being can offer another. And the person who receives it, the person who is genuinely available to receive it, who meets it with their own equivalent depth, that person will feel something that is, in the most literal sense, life-changing. Now let's talk about the thing that is hardest to address but most necessary. The question of timing, of why the realization arrives when it does, consistently, predictably, in the wake of genuine loss rather than in the presence of genuine love. Because the pattern is not random, the timing is not coincidence. And understanding why the realization is structurally located at the point of too late, rather than at any of the many points earlier where it could have been catalyzed, reveals something important about the avoidant psychology that closes the loop on everything discussed so far. The realization arrives too late because it requires the removal of the deactivating strategy's primary fuel source, your continued availability, in order to occur. While you were available, the strategy had everything it needed to keep functioning. The management could continue. The devaluation could persist. The subtle amplification of your flaws and the minimization of your qualities could operate without significant interruption. Because the strategy's purpose is to prevent the full experience of investment. And preventing the full experience of investment is much easier when the investment is ongoing and available to be managed than when it has been removed entirely. Your availability was, paradoxically, the thing that made the devaluation possible. Not because there was anything wrong with being available. Availability is not a mistake, and you should not extract from this some lesson about being less available in order to be valued. But because the deactivating strategy is a responsive system, it responds to the presence of potential attachment by generating management. And management, by definition, requires something to manage. Remove the thing being managed, remove your consistent, patient, available presence, and the strategy has nothing to push against. And without the strategy actively running, the full experience of what you represented becomes accessible. This is the mechanism underneath the too late. It is not that they didn't value you, it is that the value could not be fully felt while the system designed to prevent full feeling was actively engaged. And the system was actively engaged precisely because you were there. Your presence triggered the protection, your absence removed it. And in the unprotected space that your absence created, the value, always present, always real, always significantly larger than what was being expressed, finally had nowhere to go except directly into their awareness. And their awareness, receiving it fully for the first time, was stopped by it. That stopping is genuine. It is not performance, not manipulation, not a strategic response to losing something they were taking for granted in a calculated way. It is the authentic experience of someone whose own defense system finally failed to do its job, and who is now standing in the full unmanaged experience of what that defense system cost them. That authenticity deserves acknowledgement, not as a reason to return, not as evidence that the conditions have changed, but as the truth of what it is, a real reckoning, arriving late, in a person who is finally for the first time unable to manage their way out of fully feeling what you meant to them. And you, receiving that reckoning, or sensing it from wherever you currently stand in relation to them, you are allowed to feel multiple things simultaneously. You are allowed to feel the vindication of having your perception confirmed. The grief of a confirmation that arrives after the window of its usefulness has changed shape. The compassion of someone who understands why the timing is what it is. The clarity of someone who knows that timing and confirmation and even genuine realization are not the same as changed conditions. And the freedom, the specific hard-won freedom of someone who no longer needs the realization to happen in order to know their own worth. That last one is the most important. Because somewhere in the arc of all of this, in the confusion and the patience and the grief and the slow, unglamorous work of releasing a hope that was not serving you, you arrived at something that the realization, however genuine, cannot give you and does not need to give you. You arrived at the knowledge of your own value independent of their recognition of it. You stopped waiting for the realization to occur in order to confirm what you already knew. You stopped locating your worth in the verdict of someone whose assessment of you was being filtered through a defense system that was structurally incapable of rendering an accurate judgment. You became, in other words, your own witness, your own most reliable source. The person whose recognition of your value is the one that matters most and requires no external confirmation to remain stable. That is not a small achievement. In a culture that locates worth primarily in how we are perceived and received by others, in whether we are chosen, pursued, valued loudly and visibly by the people we want to be valued by, arriving at a genuine internal source of self-recognition is a quietly radical act. It does not photograph well, it does not make a dramatic story. It is simply the experience of waking up one day and noticing that the question of whether they have realized your value yet is no longer the first thing your mind goes to. That your day does not hinge on it. That your sense of yourself does not expand or contract based on what their realization is or isn't producing. That shift, from external to internal, is the one that changes everything going forward. Not because it makes you invulnerable, not because it eliminates the desire to be loved and chosen and recognized by someone specific, but because it changes what you are willing to accept in the absence of that recognition. It changes the floor. It raises the minimum. It makes certain compromises, the ones you were making quietly, without quite naming them as compromises, no longer available. Not through discipline or willpower, through the simple structural change of knowing your own worth in a way that makes the old accommodations feel not just uncomfortable but genuinely impossible. The avoidant who realizes your value too late is living in the consequence of a pattern that has likely repeated itself before you and will continue after you if the realization does not catalyze genuine change. You are not the first person whose absence clarified what their presence meant. You may not be the last. And that is genuinely sad. For them, for the pattern's other casualties, for the version of connection they are capable of feeling but not yet capable of sustaining. But it is not your sadness to carry indefinitely. You carried enough. You carried the weight of a love that was real, on both sides and functionally unequal in its expression. You carried the patience and the hope and the continuous exhausting work of being the stable one, the available one, the one who stayed oriented toward the connection, even when the connection was not staying oriented towards you. You carried all of that with a grace that cost you more than anyone fully saw. You can set it down now. Not the love. You do not have to stop loving someone in order to stop carrying what is not yours to carry, but the weight, the responsibility for the realization, the vigil, the waiting for them to see what you always knew was there. They see it now, or they are beginning to, or they will, in their own time, in the privacy of their own reckoning, arrive at the full, unmanaged experience of what you were. You do not need to be present for that arrival. You do not need to witness it. You do not need their seeing you clearly to confirm that you were always worth seeing clearly. You were, from the beginning, before the dynamic, before the pattern, before the devaluation and the management, and the slow, quiet cost of being loved at a volume you were not allowed to hear. Before all of it, you arrived as someone worth knowing, worth staying for, worth the full, undefended, unmanaged experience of genuine love. The fact that one person's psychology prevented them from fully inhabiting that experience in real time does not revise that truth. The fact that the realization arrived in the past tense rather than the present does not reduce what was always present. The fact that too late means something real does not mean what you brought was anything less than what it was. What it was, what you are, does not require their timeline to validate it. It simply is, fully, finally, independently. And from that place, from the ground of someone who knows their own worth, without requiring it to be confirmed by the person who took the longest to see it, everything that comes next is built differently, chosen more deliberately, entered more honestly, sustained by something more durable than hope, built on the bedrock of a person who learned, through the specific and irreplaceable education of this experience, exactly what they are worth, and decided quietly and permanently never to accept less again. There is a particular kind of freedom that arrives not with fanfare, but with stillness. You do not notice it immediately. It does not feel the way freedom is supposed to feel in the dramatic sense, expansive, euphoric, the sudden likeness of a weight removed. It feels quieter than that, more like the absence of a sound you had stopped registering as sound. A tension you had been holding for so long, it had become indistinguishable from your resting state. And one day, not a special day, not a day with any particular significance, you notice it is not there anymore. The vigilance, the monitoring, the low-grade continuous hum of wondering where you stand. That is the freedom. And it arrived not because everything resolved the way you wanted it to, but because you finally completely stopped needing it to. That stopping is worth examining, because it is not the same as giving up. It is not resignation dressed as peace. Giving up retains the shape of the wanting. It simply adds a layer of defeat over the top. What happened to you is different. The wanting itself changed. Not because you disciplined it away, or reasoned yourself out of it, or decided through an act of will that you were done, but because you grew past the specific version of wanting that required their recognition to feel complete. You outgrew the need for the confirmation, and when you outgrow a need rather than suppress it, it does not leave a hollow place. It leaves room. Room that fills, gradually and without forcing, with things that are entirely and sustainably yours. The avoidant realizing your value too late is a story about their timing. But underneath that story is a different one, about your own. About the specific timing of your own growth. About the fact that the window closed not because you became unavailable out of strategy or hurt, but because you became genuinely oriented elsewhere, toward your own life, your own becoming, your own questions about what you want and who you are becoming in the process of pursuing it. That reorientation is the real event. Everything else, their realization, the too late quality of it, the grief on both sides of the timing, all of that is the context for the real event, which is you arriving, finally and fully, at yourself. Let's talk about what that arrival actually looks like. Because it is not a destination in the static sense, it is not a place you reach and then remain, unchanged, permanently settled. It is more like a home base, something you can leave and return to, something that persists as a reference point even when life takes you far from it, temporarily. The home base is the knowledge, not as an idea, but as an embodied, reliable, daily accessible fact, that you are enough without the relationship, that your value does not fluctuate with someone else's recognition of it, that the story of who you are is not authored by whether or not you were chosen by this particular person at this particular time. Arriving at that home base does not mean you stop wanting love. It does not mean the longing for deep, mutual, fully expressed connection disappears. That longing is human and healthy and worth honoring. What changes is the quality of desperation that used to accompany it. The sense that without this specific love from this specific person, something fundamental was missing from your existence. That desperation, which was never really about them, though they became its focus, that was about something older, something that predated them entirely, something that their particular brand of inconsistency happened to activate with unusual precision. When you locate the older source, when you trace the desperation back to its actual origin, which is somewhere in your own history and your own earliest experiences of what love felt and didn't feel like, something shifts at the root level. The present situation stops carrying the full weight of the historical wound. The avoidance stops being the symbol of everything love has ever withheld from you and becomes, more accurately, one specific person with one specific set of limitations operating in one specific period of your life. Reduced to their actual size, they are easier to hold with compassion, easier to release without bitterness, easier to wish well without needing anything from them in return. Wishing them well without needing anything in return is, in its own quiet way, one of the most complete forms of freedom available. It is not performed magnanimity. It is not the ostentatious forgiveness of someone who is still, underneath, keeping score. It is the genuine, spacious experience of someone who has processed the experience fully enough that the other person's well-being is no longer entangled with their own emotional state. Who can hope, honestly, that the realization produces something real in the avoidance life? Genuine change, genuine healing, the ability to eventually inhabit love without dismantling it, without that hope being in any way conditional on being the beneficiary of that change. That is liberation, not from caring. From the particular suffering that comes from caring about someone whose growth you cannot control, whose timing you cannot determine, whose realization you cannot accelerate through any amount of love or patience or perfectly calibrated availability. You cared enormously. The caring was real and it was good, and it was one of the finest things about you in this entire chapter. And now the caring can exist without the suffering that used to be attached to it. Because the suffering required a specific condition, the condition of needing something from them that they were not yet capable of providing. And that condition no longer applies. Not because they are now capable, though they may be moving in that direction, but because you no longer need it from them. You sourced it yourself, built it internally, made yourself the primary provider of the thing you were waiting for them to give you. That internal sourcing, the building of self-worth that does not depend on external validation, is the work that makes everything going forward structurally different, not just with potential partners. In every significant relationship, in the way you occupy professional spaces, in the way you handle disagreement and criticism, and the ordinary vulnerability of being known by people who might not always receive what they know with perfect care, the internal source changes the texture of all of it. Because when your worth is not on the table, when it is not at stake in any given interaction, you relate to everything differently, more freely, more honestly, with less of the self-protective management that ironically makes you less visible rather than more protected. The management of self-presentation, the careful calibration of how much you show and when and to whom, that is its own form of avoidance, softer than the avoidance version, more socially acceptable but structurally similar in its motivation. Keeping the most vulnerable parts of yourself at a managed distance from the people who could potentially wound them. And the cost of that management is the same cost the avoidant pays, the foreclosure of full contact, of being genuinely known, of the specific intimacy that only arrives when you stop managing your own presentation and simply trustingly show up as what you are. You are ready for that intimacy now in a way you were not before. Not because you were deficient before, you were not, but because the specific fear that was driving the management has been addressed at its source. The fear of being too much, of needing too much, of your full unedited self being more than someone could hold without retreating. That fear was confirmed, in a certain sense, by the avoidant dynamic. Your full self was more than their specific system could hold without retreating. But that confirmation was context-specific. It was information about their capacity, not information about your size. You are not too much. You are exactly the right amount for the right container. And the right container, the person whose capacity matches your depth, whose own internal work has made them genuinely available for the level of intimacy you carry, that person is not intimidated by your full self. They are met by it, enlarged by it. They bring their own equivalent depth, and the meeting of the two is not overwhelming. It is generative. It creates something between you that neither of you could have built alone. That meeting is what you are moving toward. Not urgently, not as a project with a timeline, but as the natural destination of someone who has done enough internal work to be genuinely available for it. Who has cleared enough of the old pattern, the anxious reaching, the self-minimization, the tolerance of managed love, to recognize the real thing when it presents itself, to receive it without immediately testing it or finding it suspicious or waiting for the withdrawal that is no longer coming. The avoidant in your story, wherever they are in their own arc, whatever the realization is currently producing in them, they taught you something that could not have been taught more gently. That love, on its own, is not sufficient. That feeling, however genuine and however large, does not automatically translate into the capacity to sustain what it produces. That the gap between loving someone and being able to live inside that love without dismantling it is a real gap, and it is one that only the person who contains it can close. They also showed you, by contrast, what you actually need. Not the abstract, generic version of a healthy relationship. The specific, particular, detailed version, the qualities, the capacities, the ways of being present and communicating and handling difficulty and returning to each other after distance, that your specific self requires in order to feel genuinely at home in a connection. That specificity is valuable. It is the inheritance of the difficulty, the precise map of what you are looking for, drawn in the negative space of everything this was not. Follow that map, not obsessively, not as a checklist held against every new person you encounter, but as a background orientation, a quiet set of reference points that your now refined perception can navigate by. Trust the instrument. It was sharpened on real experience. It knows the difference between intensity and depth, between chemistry and compatibility, between someone who is moved by you and someone who is capable of staying moved without retreating. And as you follow it, as you move forward into whatever the next chapter holds, which is yours in a way that nothing about the last stretch was entirely yours, carry with you the full truth of what this was, not the simplified version. Not the version where they were simply unavailable and you were simply the one who loved too much. The full version, where the love was real on both sides, where the limitation was real on one side. Where you brought something extraordinary to a situation that could not fully honor it, and you stayed longer than you should have because extraordinary things are hard to walk away from. Where the too late realization is genuinely sad, for them, for the timing, for the version of this that could have existed under different conditions, and where you emerged from all of it, not diminished, but deepened. Not harder, but more honest. Not closed, but more specifically, more deliberately, more sustainably open. That openness, careful now, discerning, rooted in genuine self-knowledge, is the most valuable thing you are bringing forward. More valuable than anything that was taken. More durable than anything that was lost. The openness of someone who has been through the specific education of this and come out the other side still willing, still capable, still fundamentally oriented toward the possibility of being fully known and fully met by another human being. That willingness after everything is not naivety. It is the bravest thing about you. And it is exactly what the right person, the one whose capacity finally matches your depth, whose love does not need to be decoded or managed or received at a reduced volume, it is exactly what they will recognize in you the moment you meet. Not too late, right on time.